Every empire has a currency. Every currency has a lifespan. The Portuguese, the Spanish, the Dutch, the French, the British, now the Americans. 80 years. That is the average. That is the pattern. The dollar turned 80 in 2024. I want to show you something most financial analysts will never say on television. Not because it is classified, because it is too simple and too terrifying. Every dominant global currency in the last 500 years has followed the same arc. Rise, dominance, overextension, collapse. No empire has ever broken this sequence. The only variable is timing. The Portuguese Real dominated global trade in the early 1500s. It was backed by spice routes and colonial extraction. Portugal controlled the flow of pepper, cinnamon, and cloves into Europe. That dominance lasted approximately 90 years. Then, the empire overextended. The trade routes became too expensive to defend, and the Spanish stepped in. The Spanish silver peso became the first true world currency. Mines in Potosí flooded Europe with silver. Global trade settled in Spanish coin for over a century. That dominance lasted roughly 110 years. Then the mines began to deplete. The military stretched too thin, and another power was waiting. The Dutch guilder rose on financial innovation. The Amsterdam Exchange, the joint stock company, the world's first central bank. For approximately 80 years, the guilder was the most trusted currency on earth. Then it fell. The French livre tried to claim the throne. Revolution intervened. Collapse followed. And then came the British. When you look at your retirement account, do you know what currency it is actually denominated in? The pound sterling became the most powerful currency the modern world had ever seen. It held reserve status from approximately 1815 to 1944. By 1945, the pound still accounted for over 60% of global reserves. Think about that number, 60%. 30 years later, that share had fallen below 30%. Today, the pound holds less than 5% of global reserve holdings. This was not a slow fade across centuries. This was structural collapse within a single working lifetime. Your grandparents may have been born into a world where the pound was the center of global finance. Your parents were born into a world where it was already a relic. Every asset you hold that is priced in dollars carries an implicit assumption. The assumption is that the dollar will remain the measuring stick, the unit of account for global trade, for global energy, for global debt. This assumption feels permanent because it has been true for your entire conscious life. But permanence is a feeling. It is not a structural fact. The Bretton Woods Agreement was signed in 1944. 44 nations gathered in New Hampshire and agreed to peg their currencies to the dollar. The dollar, in turn, was pegged to gold at $35 per ounce. This was the architecture. This was the foundation that made America the center of global finance. But the peg to gold lasted only 27 years. Nixon ended it in 1971. The promise that gave the dollar its legitimacy was broken within a single generation. Have you ever considered that the stability you have experienced your entire life might be the exception, not the rule? I used to believe the dollar was different. I told myself this time was different because America was different. We had aircraft carriers in every ocean. We had Silicon Valley. We had the Federal Reserve and the Treasury and the deepest, most liquid bond market on Earth. I believed in American exceptionalism the way one believes in gravity, not as opinion, as fact. Then I started counting. The Portuguese, 90 years, the Spanish, 110 years, the Dutch, 80 years, the British, perhaps 50 years of true peak dominance before the decline became irreversible. And the Americans? The Bretton Woods system was established in 1944. We are now 80 years into that architecture. The average lifespan of reserve currency dominance is 80 to 100 years. We are not approaching the historical boundary. We are standing directly on top of it. If the pound sterling lost 90% of its reserve share in a single generation, what makes you certain the dollar cannot? The pattern is not hidden. It is not controversial among economic historians. It is simply not discussed. Because to discuss it would require admitting something deeply uncomfortable: the wealth we hold, the retirements we have planned, the mortgages we have signed. All of it is denominated in a measuring stick that history tells us will be replaced, not reformed, replaced, not in centuries, in decades. Reserve currency status is not granted by international committee. It is extracted through military superiority, through control of trade routes, through institutional dominance, through the perception of permanence. When those foundations erode, the perception erodes with them. The currency does not collapse because people stop believing in it. People stop believing because the foundations have already collapsed beneath them. Loss of faith is the final stage of the process, not the first. We are not watching a future crisis approach from a safe distance. We are watching the late stage of a pattern that has repeated 6 times in 500 years. Every empire believed it was exceptional. Every empire believed its currency would endure. Every empire was wrong. The question is not whether this pattern applies to the dollar. The question is why you would believe it does not. The pattern exists. I showed you the bodies: Portugal, Spain, the Netherlands, France, Britain. 6 reserve currencies, 6 collapses. But pattern recognition is not enough. I need to show you the mechanism, the structural reason why the dollar does not just happen to be failing, why it must fail, why its very privilege is the thing that kills it. In 1960, a Belgian economist named Robert Triffin sat before the United States Congress. He delivered a warning that would define the next 60 years of American economic history. Almost no one listened. Today, almost no one remembers. But what Triffin described was not a prediction. It was a diagnosis of a disease already embedded in the architecture. Triffin explained something that sounds counterintuitive until you see it clearly. To be the world's reserve currency, the dollar must be available everywhere. Foreign nations need dollars to settle trade, to buy oil, to hold as reserves, to price commodities. This means America must send dollars out into the world, and the only way to send dollars out is to buy more from the world than you sell. This is a trade deficit, not a choice, a structural requirement. If your job or your children's job depends on an industry that was offshored, do you understand now that this was not a mistake? The United States has run a trade deficit every single year since 1975, nearly 50 consecutive years. In recent years, that deficit has exceeded $900 billion annually. Politicians call this a problem. They promise to fix it. They blame China. They blame trade deals. They blame corporations. But they never explain why it keeps happening, regardless of who is in power, regardless of which party controls Congress, regardless of tariffs or trade wars. The reason is Triffin's dilemma. America cannot be the reserve currency and run a trade surplus. It is structurally impossible. To supply the world with dollars, we must import more than we export. To import more than we export, we must send our factories overseas. To send our factories overseas, we must hollow out our industrial base. This is not a policy failure. This is the mechanism functioning exactly as designed. I want you to understand what this means for the jobs that disappeared from your town, the factory that closed, the industry that moved to Asia. You were told this was globalization. You were told this was inevitable progress. You were told to retrain. But what actually happened was a structural requirement of reserve currency status extracting its price from the American working class. When politicians promise to bring manufacturing back, do you realize the reserve currency system makes that structurally impossible? Here is where the trap becomes inescapable. Foreign nations hold approximately $7.6 trillion in U.S. Treasury securities: China, Japan, the United Kingdom. They hold our debt because they need somewhere to store the dollars we sent them. They cannot spend all those dollars. They cannot convert them to their own currencies without crashing their export markets. So they lend them back to us. They buy our bonds. They fund our deficits. This creates the illusion of a virtuous cycle. We consume their goods. They hold our debt. Everyone benefits. But the cycle has a flaw that cannot be engineered away. Every year, the United States must issue more debt to fund the deficits required to supply global dollars. Every year, the debt grows. Every year, the interest payments grow. And every year, the structural foundation of the currency weakens. In 1971, Richard Nixon made an announcement that changed everything. He closed the gold window. The dollar would no longer be convertible to gold at any price. This was presented as a temporary measure. It became permanent within 2 years. The last constraint on dollar creation was removed. The Federal Reserve could now create unlimited currency. The only remaining constraint was confidence. I used to think 1971 was the year America cheated, the year we broke the rules. Now I see it differently. Nixon did not break the system. He revealed that the system had already broken itself. The gold reserves were draining because the trade deficits required by reserve status had already overwhelmed the nation's ability to back its currency. The gold window closed because it had to close. The alternative was immediate collapse. How much of your wealth is stored in a currency that must continuously devalue itself to function? This is the trap that looks like a privilege. The world needs dollars. So, America must create dollars. To create dollars without immediate inflation, America must issue debt. To service the debt, America must create more dollars. To maintain reserve status, America must keep the cycle running. But the cycle is not a circle. It is a spiral. And spirals do not reverse. The mechanism Triffin identified in 1960 has now run for over 60 years. The debt has grown from billions to trillions. The trade deficits have compounded. The industrial base has eroded. The military that once enforced dollar dominance now costs more than the next 10 nations combined. And that military is funded by the same debt spiral that is hollowing out the economy beneath it. No president can fix this. No Congress can legislate it away. No Federal Reserve policy can unwind it without triggering the collapse it seeks to prevent. The privilege of reserve currency status is the poison that kills the host. Every nation that has held this status has discovered the same truth. Dominance funds itself through debt. Debt erodes the foundation of dominance. The cycle does not break, it completes. The question was never whether American policymakers were competent. The question is whether any policy can escape a structural trap built into the system's foundation. Triffin knew the answer in 1960. He told Congress directly. They did not listen. They could not afford to listen. Because the only way to escape the trap is to surrender the privilege, and no empire surrenders privilege voluntarily. The mechanism is now running on its own momentum. The deficits are too large to close. The debt is too large to repay. The industrial base is too hollowed to rebuild while maintaining reserve status. Every path leads to the same destination. The only variable is timing. And timing, as I will show you, may have already run out. The timing may have already run out, but that raises the question everyone wants answered. If the dollar is structurally doomed, what replaces it? I have heard the theories: the yuan, the euro, central bank digital currencies, the BRICS basket, each one presented as the inevitable successor, each one carrying a fatal flaw that almost no one discusses. Let me show you why there is no clean heir to the throne, and why that absence is more dangerous than any single contender. The Chinese yuan is the most frequently cited successor. The logic seems obvious. China is the world's largest manufacturing economy, the largest trading nation, the largest holder of foreign reserves. If any currency should replace the dollar, it should be the yuan. This is the argument, and it collapses the moment you examine the actual structure of the Chinese financial system. A reserve currency must be freely convertible. This means any holder can exchange it for other currencies at will. No restrictions, no permissions, no government approval. This is the foundation of reserve trust. You must know that your holdings are liquid, that you can exit when you choose. The yuan does not offer this. China maintains strict capital controls. Money flows in. Money does not flow out without state approval. If you have heard that the yuan will replace the dollar, have you asked why China refuses to open its capital account? This is not an oversight. It is a deliberate policy choice. China's economic model depends on controlling capital flows. Open the capital account, and wealthy Chinese citizens move their money offshore. Open the capital account, and currency speculation becomes uncontrollable. Open the capital account, and the state loses the ability to direct investment where it chooses. The capital controls are not a bug. They are the operating system. A reserve currency requires three things: liquidity, convertibility, rule of law. The yuan has liquidity, it lacks convertibility, and rule of law remains subject to party authority. These are not problems that can be fixed with policy adjustments. They are structural features of the Chinese system. To become the reserve currency, China would have to become something other than China. The BRICS nations announced de-dollarization initiatives at their 2023 and 2024 summits. Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. Now expanded to include others. The headlines were dramatic. The substance was thin. These nations do not share a unified fiscal policy. They do not share a unified central bank. They do not even share aligned interests. What they share is a common discomfort with dollar dominance. Discomfort is not architecture. The euro presents itself as the sophisticated alternative, a currency backed by developed economies, integrated financial markets, institutional depth. But I need you to understand what the euro actually is. In 1992, the Maastricht Treaty created a currency without a country. 19 different nations share the euro. 19 different treasuries. 19 different debt loads. 19 different political systems. One currency. No fiscal union. Do you believe a currency backed by 19 different treasuries can survive the next sovereign debt crisis? I watched the Eurozone crisis of 2010 to 2015. Greece, Portugal, Spain, Ireland. Each nation buckled under debt loads they could not inflate away. Why could they not inflate? Because they did not control their own currency. They had surrendered monetary sovereignty to the European Central Bank. They kept fiscal sovereignty but lost the pressure valve. The euro nearly collapsed. It was held together by emergency interventions that violated the founding treaties. The structure was not fixed. It was patched. The euro cannot be a true reserve currency because it lacks a sovereign. There is no single European treasury. There is no single European bond backed by unified taxation authority. When crisis comes, the question is always the same. Who pays? Germany? France? The periphery? The answer changes with each election cycle. Reserves require permanence. The euro offers negotiation. Now, I must address the contender that receives the least critical attention. Central bank digital currencies, CBDCs. Over 130 countries are now exploring or actively developing digital currencies issued by their central banks. This is not a fringe experiment. This is a coordinated global movement, and it carries implications that most people have not thought through. When someone tells you digital currencies are the future, do you understand that programmable money means someone else controls your access? A CBDC is not simply a digital version of cash. It is programmable money. The issuing authority can set conditions on its use, expiration dates, geographic restrictions, purchase category limits, social credit integration. This is not speculation. These features are being tested in active pilot programs. The Chinese digital yuan already allows transaction tracking at the individual level. The technology enables control that physical cash never permitted. A reserve currency requires trust. Trust that your holdings cannot be frozen. Trust that your access cannot be revoked. Trust that the rules will not change after you have committed your wealth. CBDCs offer the opposite of trust. They offer surveillance. They offer control. They offer programmability. No nation will store its reserves in an instrument that another nation can turn off. Here is what I need you to see. The three contenders are not competing to replace the dollar. They are revealing that no replacement is ready. The yuan cannot open without destroying the system that created it. The euro cannot unify without becoming something it was designed to avoid. CBDCs cannot earn trust while offering control. This absence is not a temporary condition. It is a structural gap. When the British pound began its decline after 1944, the dollar was ready. Bretton Woods had prepared the architecture. American industrial dominance was at its peak. Military supremacy was unquestioned. The transition was not seamless, but the successor was clear. Today, there is no Bretton Woods waiting, no clear successor standing ready to absorb the role. The dollar is weakening. The contenders are flawed. And the space between decline and succession is where the real danger lives. The question is not what comes after the dollar. The question is what happens when nothing is ready to come after. That gap has a name. It has appeared before, and what it did to wealth the last time it opened should terrify anyone paying attention. That gap has a name. Historians call it The interregnum, the period between empires, the years when one reserve currency has weakened beyond function, but no successor has emerged to replace it. This is not a theoretical construct. It has happened before, and what occurred during the last interregnum should tell you everything you need to know about what is coming. The British pound began its structural decline after World War I. Britain had financed the war through debt. The empire was overextended. The industrial base was damaged. But the pound still held approximately 60% of global reserves in 1945. The dollar was rising, but not yet dominant. For roughly 20 years, the world existed in a state of monetary ambiguity. Two currencies competing. Neither fully trusted. No clear foundation. Those 20 years were 1919 to 1939, the interwar period, the Great Depression, the collapse of the gold standard, hyperinflation in Germany, deflation in America, bank failures across Europe, currency controls, trade wars, and the complete destruction of middle-class savings in multiple countries simultaneously. That was not a coincidence. That was the interregnum. If the pound lost its reserve status within your grandparents' lifetime, why do you assume the dollar will outlast yours? The pattern is precise. When a reserve currency weakens before a successor is ready, the gap does not create stability. It creates chaos. Nations scramble to protect themselves. They hoard gold. They impose capital controls. They devalue competitively. Trade contracts, wealth that existed on paper, evaporates. Not because people made bad investments, because the measuring stick itself became unreliable. I need you to understand what happens to purchasing power during this phase. The British pound fell from approximately 60% of global reserves to under 5% in less than 30 years. If you held pound-denominated assets during that collapse, your wealth did not transition smoothly into dollar assets. It was destroyed during the transition. The interregnum does not transfer wealth from one currency to another. It transfers wealth from those who do not understand what is happening to those who do. The United States national debt now exceeds $34 trillion. The interest payments on that debt now exceed the entire defense budget. Read that again. We are spending more on interest than we spend on the military that enforces the currency system. This is not sustainable. This is not a problem that gets solved with tax increases or spending cuts. The debt spiral is now self-reinforcing, and it is accelerating. In 1971, when Nixon closed the gold window, gold was priced at $35 per ounce. By 1980, gold had risen above $800 per ounce. That was not gold becoming more valuable. That was the dollar becoming structurally unmoored. The purchasing power did not disappear. It relocated. If you understood the break, you preserved wealth. If you trusted the system, you lost. Can you point to a single reserve currency transition that did not destroy middle-class savings? I cannot, and I have looked. Every transition punishes those who remain anchored to the dying system. The Portuguese, who held reals, the Spanish, who held silver pesos, the Dutch, who held guilders, the British, who held sterling. Each transition created a class of people who believed stability would return. It did not return. It was replaced by a new system that did not include them. Here is the part that most analysts will not say clearly. The interregnum has already begun. You are not watching this approach from a distance. You are inside it. The symptoms are already visible. Inflation that persists despite rate hikes, deficits that grow regardless of policy, foreign nations quietly reducing treasury holdings, gold reaching all-time highs while stock markets pretend nothing is wrong. These are not random events. These are the early signatures of a reserve currency transition. The dollar is not collapsing tomorrow, but it is losing functionality now, slowly, structurally, in ways that do not make headlines but that compound quietly. The Chinese are settling oil trades in yuan. The Europeans are exploring alternatives to SWIFT. The BRICS nations are building parallel payment systems. These are not provocations. These are preparations. Other nations see what is coming. They are positioning, quietly, without announcement. If the transition has already begun, what have you done to recognize it? The core illusion is this. You were told that if the dollar were truly in danger, you would know. There would be warnings. There would be announcements. There would be time to react. This belief is false. Reserve currency transitions do not announce themselves. They reveal themselves in retrospect. The pound did not collapse in a single event. It bled function for 30 years. And by the time the average British citizen understood what had happened, their savings had already been cut in half. Visibility comes too late. The transition does not begin when the headlines scream crisis. It begins when the structural foundation erodes beneath the surface. It begins when deficits become unpayable, when allies begin to hedge, when trust erodes faster than it can be rebuilt. These conditions already exist. The interregnum is not a future risk. It is a present condition that most people have not yet named. I used to believe that understanding the pattern would be enough, that if I could see it clearly, I could explain it clearly, and people would act. Now I understand differently. Most people will not act, not because they do not understand, because understanding requires admitting that the stability they have built their lives around is temporary. That admission is too expensive, so they will wait. They will hope. They will trust that someone in power will fix this. No one is going to fix this. The mechanism is too far gone. The debt is too large. The deficits are structural. The military costs are locked in. The political system cannot make the choices required to reverse course because those choices would end reserve currency status immediately. The trap is complete. Policymakers are not stupid. They are trapped. And trapped people do not make optimal choices. They make survival choices. And survival choices accelerate the crisis they are trying to delay. Interregnums do not replace one system with another cleanly. They dissolve the old system first. The new system stabilizes later, sometimes decades later. The gap between dissolution and stabilization is where purchasing power dies. It is where wealth transfers from the unprepared to the positioned. It is where entire classes of people discover that the money they saved, the retirement they planned, the security they assumed was denominated in a unit that no longer holds its value. You are not preparing for a future crisis. You are failing to recognize a present one. The question was never whether the dollar would fall. The question was whether you would understand the pattern before your purchasing power was transferred. The window is not closing. For most people, it has already closed. The dollar is not dying tomorrow. It is dying now. Slowly. Structurally. And the ones who see it first do not warn you. They position